Thank you. That was wonderful. When asked, what church do you belong to? Many of us respond, Unitarian, often forgetting to add the second half of our name, because Unitarian Universalist is quite a mouthful, and so it's quite natural to shorten it. When the denominations merged in 1961, there was a notion to choose a totally new name like United Liberal Church of America. But both denominations wanted to keep their historic name, And some Universalists were happy with the outcome, noting that Universalist is a noun and Unitarian is an adjective, merely describing what type of Universalists we are. But common usage of the American language seldom follows the rules of English grammar. So when people shorten our name, typically they drop the Universalists. Today, I urge you to use our full name, Unitarian Universalists. Unitarian Universalists. And then when people ask you what church it is, some of you may even want to add extra Unitarian Universalist Fellowship. I do not want us to forget our Universalist heritage. Universalism is the older denomination. I'll give you a little timeline here. In 1741, George de Benville founded a Universalist church in Pennsylvania. In 1770, John Murray first preached upon the shore of New Jersey and set up many congregations in New England. By 1790, the Universalist Declaration of Faith was written in part by Benjamin Rush, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. By 1793, we became officially established as a denomination in America. In 1803, Jose Ballou wrote a treatise on atonement, useful tool for evangelizing and spreading the message of universal salvation. All people were going to heaven. A loving God would not send his children to hell. Now, this message scared many who thought that people would go wild without the threat of hell. But the tradition grew, especially in rural areas where people were migrating to avoid authority, including church authority. By 1888, it was reportedly the sixth largest denomination in the United States. But it soon declined after that. And why was that? First, many mainline Christian churches adopted the Universalist focus on building the kingdom of God on earth rather than preaching hellfire. Some Baptists, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, and Methodists began proclaiming the social gospel, and Universalism lost its distinction as a liberal form of Christianity. Secondly, Universalists resisted strong denominational ties. They were even more independent than the Unitarians, and this poor organization prevented them from managing the many gains that they made. Like Methodists, they would send circuit riders out into the frontier, but they had no system of bishops to keep those churches functioning after they were established. For example, in 1826, Jacob Fries settled in Wilmington, North Carolina. In 1827, he founded 5 more churches in nearby counties. And then he returned to Rhode Island in 1828, and none of those churches survived. In 1835, a church was established at Red Hills near Clinton, North Carolina, and that is one of the few Universalist congregations that continues in North Carolina to this day. Now, the Unitarian Church, on the other hand, was centered primarily around Harvard Divinity School. Content with the neighborhood of Boston, they were less evangelical than the Universalists. The theology of the two groups was similar, but class divisions kept them apart. Unitarians preferred a scholarly style of preaching. The old joke goes that a Unitarian doesn't think they've heard a good sermon unless they didn't understand half of it. Well, the Universalists appealed to the emotion of an all-loving God. Unitarians emphasized self-reliance, while Universalists emphasized the dependence upon God. In Boston, Ballou challenged Unitarians to admit that when they talk about the perfectibility of all human beings and following the example of Jesus and that humans are basically good, that they had very strong universalist tendencies and that they should just come out and declare themselves universalists as well. But Channing, the founder of Boston Unitarianism, refused to even acknowledge him or answer him publicly. Unitarians emphasized the freedom of all people, and Universalists emphasize the equality of all people under God's grace. Now, freedom and equality seem to walk hand in hand. We kind of list them all in one paragraph when we talk about the American virtues. But they are different, because freedom emphasizes the rights of the individual, and equality emphasizes balance in the whole community. So both denominations gave rise to some abolitionists, but they came at it from different philosophical perspectives. Unitarians believed that if African slaves were allowed to be free, they could become equal with the rest of humanity. Whereas Universalists started that God created them all equal, therefore they should be freed. Despite these differences in style, Unitarians and Universalists continued to meet each other on social issues. As early as 1775, Benjamin Franklin and Benjamin Rush founded the first anti-slavery society in America. Franklin had attended a Unitarian church in England, and Rush, 15 years later, would be one of the founders of Universalism. So even before we were denominations, we were meeting each other. When the Universalist Clara Barton founded the first chapter of the American Red Cross, she encouraged her friend, Susan B. Anthony, a Unitarian, to found the second chapter. Unitarian activist Horace Mann and Universalist legislator Thomas Whittemore worked to establish public schools in Massachusetts. And in 1878, the Unitarian and Universalist churches of Mukwonago, Wisconsin, became the first to form a joint congregation. And that congregation still exists to these days. And it's the place where I did my first child dedication. And it was a Trinitarian baptism, a very Christian ceremony that this particular couple wanted. Now, so they've been bumping heads and kind of seeing that they had common purpose. So in 1900, both denominations passed a resolution that closer cooperation is desirable and practicable. So they thought that it might be something that they could do. It just took them 60 years to do it. By 1937, they had cooperated in publishing a hymnal. And in 1953, they formed a Council of Liberal Churches, which consolidated their religious education programs. By 1961, we joined together. In general, the Universalists were more Christian than the Unitarians. But within Unitarianism, there was a strong remnant of Christian congregations that did not follow the trends of transcendentalism and humanism. And within Universalism, there was a group who called themselves the Humilate, and they argued for a religion that was more universal than Christianity. And they had a big influence among the Universalists. And one of the people that was influenced by them was Kenneth Patton, who started the Charles Street Church in Boston. And in that church, he had over 64 different religious symbols on the wall. And then on the altar was painted a spiral galaxy and a fresco of the universe. And he was very interested in science being a spiritual source for humans. And so it's no surprising that he was invited to speak here in 1960, and he was here. In 1961, 183 Universalist congregations voted for merger, and 40 voted against it. Unitarians, 555 for, and 54 against. This fellowship voted for merger or consolidation, 11-3 with one abstention. But even the dissenting congregations accepted the results of democracy and joined the new organization. In both denominations, debates about God and atheism were trumped by the commitment to freedom of belief and a commitment to freedom and equality, willingness to live with the contradictions that brings. As Jose Ballou had said, let love continue. If we agree in love, there is no disagreement that can cause us any injury. But if we do not, no other agreement can do us any good. So now, if someone asks you, do Unitarian Universalists believe in God? You can reply, we believe in something bigger than God. We believe in something bigger than atheism. We believe as Unitarians in what unites people, and as Universalists, we believe all people are worthy. Ask 25 Unitarians if they believe in God. You will find 25 definitions of the word belief, a long debate about the meaning of in, and 25 definitions of God. But this is possible because we believe in something bigger than God. We believe in something bigger than atheism. We believe in individuals and as humanity as a whole. Unitarian means one, Universalism means all. One and all seem like opposite concepts, but they are united in that immortal phrase by Alexander Dumas, all for one and one for all. We cherish those who believe differently because we know at some mysterious level we are all connected. My mother, when angry and confused by another person's action, would say, "It takes all kinds to make this world." We believe in something bigger than God. We believe in something bigger than atheism. We know that it takes all kinds to make this world. How we act is more important than what we say we believe. Let us love one another, each one and all of us. As the 16th century Unitarian Francis David put it, we need not think alike to love alike. We are Unitarian Universalists. I know some of you may have been raised Universalists, or some of you were here around the time of merger. And if I've only touched on some of the things that I've read in books, but I'd especially appreciate to hear from those who have experience in these two denominations coming together, or any other thoughts that people may have.
We were members, we were Unitarians in East Lansing, Michigan in 1954 to 58, and we had become Unitarian. I attended the first fellowship here in 53, and in late 1957, I believe, under the Universalist minister, Jerry Wyman, we became one of the first Unitarian Universalist churches.
Charlie, one of the interesting things about the years prior to merger, when there was increasing cooperation between the two denominations, it was not uncommon for Universalist ministers to be called to Unitarian churches, and vice versa, for Unitarian ministers to be called to Universalist churches. But I wanted to say another word about Charles Street Meeting House. Into the 60s, it was kept going with a subsidy from the denomination. It eventually had to close its doors, and one of the unfortunate things in our history, that here was this congregation of wonderfully creative people who did marvelous things with the arts in their worship services Sunday after Sunday, and drawn upon the writings of various religions of the world. All these marvelous creative people, but there wasn't an MBA in the group. And they couldn't raise a budget. And ultimately, the church had to close its doors.
I don't want to get into something that I avoid like the plague, which is the religious debate. But you use the phrase that causes me personally a little concern. That is that the notion of something bigger than God. I don't know what you mean by that, and I don't really care. And I don't care what anybody else feels. But for me, there is nothing greater than the concept or the God, as I choose to call it, that controls my life, has guided my life, and has set down the principles by which I try to live.
Yeah. And the roots of that phrase for me come from Paul Tillich, who urged people to see the God behind God, because what often is put up by various religions as God is so limited by human culture that there is something even beyond, and so that there's something that's even beyond the name God itself is too limiting for how big to contain what is ultimate in this world. And so that's the thought behind what I say.
Would you tell people about that bit of research you found out about the money from the merger? That was really fascinating.
Well, there's things I learned while looking up other things. Sidney J. Harris was a wonderful columnist in the 60s and 70s, and that was one of his favorite things. That shortly after the merger in 1968, the Black Empowerment movement demanded some money from the Unitarian Universalist Association, saying, put your money where your mouth is. And a lot of the money didn't work on developing things like, making sure that we were a more integrated congregation. They generally gave it to good causes outside of the denomination that helped foster Black pride in America. And we gave the grant to the professor who developed Kwanzaa. So we
mentioned this, it's very interesting. I'm not sure he ever proved that we had a good time doing it. Bill?
There's one more vestige of the Universalist side in the state, and it's a small camp and conference center called Shelter Neck, which is still used annually by the Universalists for their annual conference, and maybe 50 people gather a year. And it's also part of what the camp and conference center, like Susie's creation, like the mountain that we know about. Shelter Neck is one more of those little pods. It's about 25 miles inland from and north of Bloomington. So it's still there for us to grow if we ever get the interest to do it.
Thank you for your comments. Let us continue in singing hymn number 318, We Would Be One.